Welcome back to the channel. There are certain mysteries in history that seem to hold their silence with unusual strength. Cases where the truth feels close enough to touch, yet somehow always stays just out of reach. One of these is the story of Room 1046, a quiet hotel room in Kansas City during the winter of 1935. It is a story that begins with a man who arrived without luggage, without clear purpose, and without a name that truly belonged to him. The hotel staff remembered him as polite, reserved, and difficult to understand. But what they could not have known was that his presence would soon leave a question that nearly a century later still remains unanswered. The man checked into the hotel president using the name Roland T. Owen. He was young, looked tired in a way that suggested long travel or long worry, and carried almost nothing. No suitcase, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate where he had come from or where he intended to go. The room he chose, number 1046 on the 10th floor, would become the center of one of the most puzzling mysteries in American crime history. From the beginning, his behavior drew subtle attention. He kept the blinds drawn and the lights dim, as though the daylight itself was too bright or too revealing. He often sat in silence, sometimes just staring at the room's single telephone. When he did speak, his words were quiet and careful. And yet, what stood out most was the sense that he was waiting for something or someone. Hotel staff noticed that he received calls from a person he addressed only as Don. The tone of these conversations was tense, private, and difficult to interpret from the outside. There was a seriousness in the way he spoke, a certain controlled caution, almost as if he feared being overheard. He never explained who Don was, and no one ever saw this person enter the hotel. As the days passed, the atmosphere around room 1046 grew heavier. There was the feeling of something unspoken, unfolding behind the closed door, a quiet struggle, invisible but present. And then, without warning, the silence inside the room shattered. When hotel staff eventually entered the room, they found Roland severely injured. The room was locked from the inside, making the scene even more bewildering. What happened inside that locked space, and who else might have been involved, would soon become one of the central puzzles of the case. This is where our story begins, not with a clear act or a clear motive, but with a man alone in a hotel room, a false name, and a secret he carried so carefully that even his final moments could not reveal it. From the moment the hotel staff saw the man who called himself Roland T. Owen, one detail stood out more than anything else. He had almost nothing with him. No suitcase, no spare clothing, no toiletries, not even a coat, despite the cold January weather in Kansas City. It was unusual enough to remember, and unusual enough to become one of the important clues later. A person traveling alone in the 1930 seconds might have been modest, but they still traveled with something. Yet this man seemed to carry the bare minimum needed to exist. Inside room 1046, the absence felt even more pronounced. The drawers were empty. The closet had nothing hanging inside. There were no personal letters, no photographs, no name tags, and no sign of where he had been before he arrived. The only items found in the room originally were those belonging to the hotel itself: standard towels, the hotel's stationery, the hotel's soap. It was as if Roland had made a deliberate effort to leave no trace of himself, no story the room could tell. Even the way he interacted with the room suggested caution. He kept the lights dim or completely off for long periods of time, almost as if he did not want to be seen clearly, not by someone outside, and perhaps not even by someone inside. Housekeeping staff remembered that when they came to clean, he would either ask them to leave quickly or would stand silently while they worked, watching but not actively engaging. It gave the impression that the room was not meant to feel lived in. It was more like a temporary shelter, a waiting place, or even a hiding space. People often say that the things we carry show who we are, what we value, where we come from, where we are going. In Roland's case, the lack of objects was a statement in itself. It suggested a man who did not want to be followed, recognized, or remembered. A man whose past was meant to stay behind him, hidden. Whether he was running away from something or running towards something remains unknown. But the emptiness of the room made one thing clear. This was not a casual traveler. Later, when investigators tried to track his identity, the absence of personal items became a major barrier. There were no initials stitched into clothing, no receipts or train tickets, no wallet, no contact information, no luggage tags. Without these everyday breadcrumbs, the case had nothing to anchor itself to. It was as if he had intentionally removed every clue that might connect him to a place, a family, or a history. This detail, his near total anonymity, became one of the reasons the mystery endured. And at that stage, no one at the hotel could have imagined just how deeply this silence around his identity would complicate everything that followed. As the days passed inside room 1046, one detail began to draw attention more than anything else: the phone calls. The hotel staff noticed that the man calling himself Roland T, Owen, often received or made calls to a person he referred to simply as Don. The conversations were never loud or emotional, but they carried a tone that suggested tension beneath the surface. Roland's voice would become restrained, measured, almost guarded. It was the way someone speaks when every word feels like it matters. There were no casual greetings, no relaxed familiarity. The exchanges sounded more like instructions, disagreements, or negotiations. Sometimes Roland paused for long stretches, as though listening carefully or waiting for something to be said on the other end. To the hotel staff, who overheard fragments, it was clear that this was not a conversation between friends. It had structure, distance, and a sense of pressure. No one ever saw Don enter the hotel. No visitor by that name was registered. And yet Roland acted as if Don was very real, very important, and possibly very near. On one occasion, housekeeping staff recalled hearing Roland say something along the lines of, "No, Don, I do not want to eat. I am not hungry." The reply on the other end was not audible, but Roland's tone suggested that he was not free to choose for himself. The words were simple, but the relationship behind them felt complicated. Sometimes Roland seemed to be waiting for the calls. He would sit by the phone in silence for long periods, as if anticipating a message or an order. Other times, he appeared unsettled after the conversations ended, pacing the room or sitting very still with his head down. The atmosphere in room 1046 shifted noticeably, depending on whether the phone had rung. Hotel staff also recalled that Roland asked them to leave the door unlocked at times, as if he was expecting someone to arrive. Yet there were moments when he seemed equally afraid of someone entering. It was a contradiction that hinted at something more layered happening beneath the surface. Loyalty mixed with fear, familiarity mixed with threat. Who was Don? A friend, an associate, someone he owed something to, someone he trusted, or someone he was being controlled by. The phone calls became one of the few clues suggesting that Roland was not alone in his story, even if physically he spent most of his time in isolation. They also introduced a recurring theme that would follow the case for decades: the idea of unseen influence. Someone beyond the room appeared to hold power over Roland, power strong enough to shape his behavior, his silence, and perhaps his fate. Even long after the case became public, the name Don continued to surface in retellings, investigations, and theories. Yet no one ever confirmed who he was. Like so much in this case, He remained a presence without a face, a voice without a history, a shadow that crossed the line between fact and uncertainty. The longer Roland stayed in room 1046, the more it appeared that he was not acting according to his own comfort or freedom. Small, consistent behaviors suggested that he was living under pressure, as though someone else, someone not physically present, was influencing his decisions. The hotel staff noticed that Roland rarely left the room for long. When he did step out, he seemed to move with purpose, not leisure. No wandering the lobby, no casual conversation, no meals in the dining area. He behaved like someone who had instructions to follow, or someone who was trying to avoid being seen. One of the most striking signs was his reluctance to speak about himself. When staff asked polite, everyday questions where he had traveled from, how long he planned to stay, whether he needed anything, Roland would answer with vague, incomplete responses. His tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable caution to it, as if sharing too much, even accidentally, carried risk. His handling of the room also reflected this fear. He kept the blinds drawn tight, even during daylight, letting in only a narrow line of dull light. Guests often enjoyed the high city view from the 10th floor, but Roland never seemed to look outside. The room itself stayed dim, the overhead light often off. Hotel employees later said it felt as though he was hiding in plain sight, using the room as a barrier rather than a place to rest. Even more telling was how he responded when someone knocked. He would pause before opening the door, sometimes asking, "Who is it?" even when the voice was familiar. When housekeeping entered, Roland often stood in a position that allowed him to watch both the door and the hallway. It was not paranoia in an exaggerated sense. It was controlled, subtle watchfulness, the kind displayed by someone who expects someone else to appear at any moment. There were reports of Roland sitting for long periods in silence, simply staring into the darkness, waiting. This kind of stillness did not resemble contemplation. It resembled a person who has learned to exist in a situation where movement might draw attention. These behaviors suggested one of two possibilities. He was being followed, and he knew it. Or he believed he was being followed, and the fear was internal. In either case, the effect was the same. Roland lived as though he had no autonomy, whether the source of control was emotional, financial, physical, or psychological. The restraint was visible. This quiet tension, the waiting, the caution, the darkened room set the tone for everything that would happen next. Whatever story Roland carried with him into room 1046, it was not a story of freedom. It was a story of someone already cornered, already afraid, long before the violence that would later unfold. The sequence of events that led to the discovery of what happened in room 1046 began quietly, almost without alarm. Hotel staff had noticed that the room remained unnaturally still, the "Do Not Disturb" sign left in place longer than usual. When they knocked, there was either no answer or a faint voice telling them to return later. At first, this did not seem urgent. Many guests valued privacy, but by the following day, something about the silence felt different. It was no longer simply privacy. It had shifted into absence. When a bellboy was finally sent to check the room, he found the door locked from the inside. That alone suggested that whoever had been in the room was still there. But when he called out to the occupant, the response was strange, distant, and weak. The voice told him to enter, even though the door remained locked. The contradiction made the moment unsettling. If the man wanted assistance, why not unlock the door? And if he could not, what had happened inside? A hotel employee retrieved a master key, but even then, the door did not open fully. It was blocked from within, as though something or someone was preventing it. When the employee finally managed to push the door enough to see inside, the scene was dim and difficult to understand at first. The room was nearly dark, the only light coming from a small lamp. The curtains remained tightly drawn, and seated inside, on the edge of the bed, was Roland. His body was hunched. His skin appeared pale. He was alive, but barely. The sheets and towels were stained with dark patches that, in the half-light, could be mistaken for shadows. But they were not shadows. The staff soon noticed the marks on the walls. There were smears of something that looked like it had been wiped or dragged, as though a struggle had taken place quietly, with no cries for help. When the lights were switched on, the truth of the situation became clearer and more disturbing. Roland had suffered severe physical injuries. He had been struck repeatedly, and there were wounds on his body that suggested something far more intense than a brief confrontation. Yet the room showed no signs of forced entry. No furniture overturned. No loud disturbance had been reported by neighboring rooms. And still, the door had been locked from the inside. This detail became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. How could such violence occur without anyone hearing it? And how could the door be locked from within if another person had been involved? There were only a few possibilities, and none of them brought clarity. Instead, they deepened the mystery. Either Roland had somehow locked the door after being attacked, or the person who harmed him had a way to leave without unlocking the door in a normal way. Both explanations felt improbable, but one of them had to be true. Room 1046 was no longer just a place where a man stayed. It had become a sealed puzzle, a space where something dark had happened, but whose answers seemed to vanish the moment the door closed. When medical assistants arrived, the full extent of Roland's injuries revealed a disturbing truth. What had occurred in room 1046 was not a brief confrontation or a simple attack. It was sustained violence, delivered with intention. Doctors found that he had suffered multiple blows to the head from a blunt object. There were distinct marks on his body that suggested he had been restrained or held down. In addition, there were stab wounds, sharp, deliberate, located in places that implied the assault was not chaotic, but controlled. His wrists showed deep impressions, as if they had been bound for a period of time. His chest and abdomen carried sharp injuries that, while serious, seemed designed not to end life instantly, but to inflict pain and compliance. The pattern of wounds suggested something closer to interrogation than a fight. Someone had wanted something from him. Answers, obedience, silence. The exact goal remains unknown, but the nature of the violence spoke for itself. Even more unsettling was Roland's condition while he was examined. He was conscious weak, barely able to speak, but conscious. When questioned by hotel staff and later by authorities, his responses were slow and fragmented. He claimed that he had fallen or injured himself, an explanation that did not align with the severity and variety of his wounds. His tone was flat, without panic or desperation, almost resigned. It was as if he was still protecting something or someone. When asked if anyone else had been in the room, Roland stated that no one had been there. This statement conflicted with the evidence. The room contained marks suggesting the presence of another person. The injuries were not self-inflicted. The locked door, the withheld identity, the tense phone calls, everything pointed to the involvement of another individual. Yet Roland refused to identify anyone or describe what had happened. His silence in these final moments became one of the most meaningful aspects of the case. It implied loyalty, fear, or an understanding that speaking would lead to consequences even in his condition. Perhaps he believed that telling the truth would not save him. Perhaps he believed it would harm someone else. Or perhaps he had already accepted the outcome long before the violence took place. Despite urgent medical treatment, Roland's condition worsened. His body could not recover from the trauma. Not long after being found, he passed away. He died without revealing who Don was, what he was running from, or who had come to room 1046. His final days remained locked in silence, a silence as tightly sealed as the door that had once concealed him. And with his death, the mystery of the room did not resolve. It deepened. The room had held the event, but not the explanation. At that point in 1935, authorities had a crime, a victim, and a scene, but no identity, no motive, and no suspect. The story was only beginning. After Roland's death, investigators turned to the most basic question: who was he? A person's identity is usually the starting point in any case. Names lead to families, histories, relationships, and eventually to explanations. But when authorities searched for records under the name Roland T. Owen, they found nothing. No birth records, no employment, no travel logs, no family inquiries, nothing to confirm that such a person had ever existed. The name, it seemed, was not a name at all. It was a surface, a cover, something chosen for the moment. This realization changed the direction of the case. Instead of investigating a crime against a known individual, police now faced the task of identifying someone who had taken clear measures to erase his past. The lack of personal belongings suddenly took on greater significance. The absence of a suitcase, letters, photographs, stamps, bus tickets, objects that normally connect a person to the world was not coincidence. It was intentional. The only items linked to him were things that belonged to the hotel. Even the comb, toothbrush, and hairbrush, common items people travel with, were missing. If there had been any, they were removed before help arrived. Whether this was done by Roland or someone who visited the room remained uncertain, but the effect was the same. There was no trace of who he had been before arriving in Kansas City. Investigators began a nationwide effort to connect his face to missing persons reports. Photographs of him, both taken while he was alive and after his death, were shared with newspapers across the United States. The case drew attention, not just for the mystery of the violence, but for the mystery of the man without a past. Readers were intrigued. How could someone exist without leaving marks behind? For months, leads came in, but each one faded. People claimed to recognize him, then said they were mistaken. Families searching for missing sons, brothers, or husbands offered hopeful matches, but none aligned with the details. The story circulated widely, yet no one stepped forward to say, "I knew him." Not a single person claimed him, not as a friend, not as a coworker, not as family. In a time before digital records, identity was still grounded in relationships, neighbors, employers, relatives. And yet Roland seemed to have severed all ties before arriving at the hotel. Whether he was trying to disappear or had been forced to vanish remained a question without answer. His silence in life continued into his death. The mystery now had a new dimension. Not only what happened in room 1046, but who was the man who lived and died there. The story had no direction to move forward because it lacked the simplest foundation, a true name. This uncertainty left the investigation suspended in a kind of waiting, just as Roland himself had spent his final days waiting in the dimness of that room. The case now rested in the hands of chance. Someone, somewhere, would have to recognize him. Until then, the man in room 1046 remained a stranger. With no confirmed identity and no personal history to follow, investigators turned to the only resource left, the public. Newspapers across the country began to print the story of the young man who had died in room 1046. Photographs of him first taken while he was still alive in the hospital, then later after his death, were shared widely. The intention was simple. Someone, somewhere, must recognize him. In the 1930 seconds, newspapers were one of the most powerful means of communication, and this case quickly captured attention. Not only was the violence unsettling, but the absence of a known name created a sense of unease. People are used to stories with context: who the person was, why the event happened, what led to the tragedy. Here, there was only the tragedy and a silence around everything else. Readers across the United States sent in possible leads. Families who had missing sons wrote to the police, hoping that this young man could be the one they had lost. Some suggested that his appearance resembled someone who had left home years earlier. Others believed he might have been a worker, a traveler, or a soldier. But when these suggestions were compared against available details, none matched fully. There were always inconsistencies. Ages off by a few years, hair color slightly different, height not quite right. Each lead rose briefly with hope, then faded. The public's fascination grew as the case spread across state lines. Hotels, boarding houses, and rail stations were contacted. Police departments in distant cities were asked to cross-check their missing persons lists. Even private citizens tried to assemble theories. Yet the puzzle remained unyielding. Every detail of the man's life seemed to have been removed before his arrival in Kansas City, as if someone had erased him carefully. The photographs of him after death, quiet, expressionless, became a kind of symbol of the mystery itself. Some newspapers commented on how calm he appeared, despite the brutality he had endured. This contrast only fueled speculation. Who was he? What had happened to him before he entered that room? And why had he chosen or been forced to travel without any identifiable belongings? Weeks passed. Then months. The case that had once seemed urgent began to settle into a quieter, unresolved space. Newspapers shifted to new headlines. People moved on. The nation had recognized the story, considered it, and then, without new information, let it fade. The man from room 1046, whoever he once was, remained suspended in anonymity. But the story did not disappear entirely. It lingered quietly, like an unfinished sentence waiting for something or someone to return and complete it. The identity remained unknown, the motive unclear, and the case unsolved. The mystery now belonged not just to the investigators, but to everyone who had seen the photographs and wondered about the life behind the face. The silence continued. Nearly a full year passed before the silence surrounding the identity of the man from room 1046 finally shifted. In early 1936, a young woman from Birmingham, Alabama, happened to see one of the published photographs of the unknown victim, an image that had resurfaced in a newspaper months after interest in the case had largely faded. She recognized the face, not with uncertainty or hesitation, but with the kind of familiarity that comes from personal memory. She believed the young man was someone she had known back home, Artemus Ogletree, a teenager who had left his family and disappeared without explanation. She informed the family, and Artemus's mother confirmed the resemblance immediately. The jawline, the hair, the eyes, these were details a parent could recognize, even in death. When authorities compared physical features and past descriptions, the match aligned. The man who had lived and died under the false name Roland T. Owen was, in truth, Artemus Ogletree, only about 17 or 18 years old at the time of his death. His mother revealed that Artemus had left Birmingham to travel, hoping to see more of the world or find work. He sent occasional letters, brief and vague, but they had stopped months before his death. With the confirmation of identity, it seemed for a moment that the case might finally begin to make sense. Knowing who Artemus was could lead to knowing who he had met, who he had trusted, and who might have been involved in his final days. But instead of offering clarity, the revelation opened new questions. Why had Artemus used a false name? Why had he traveled without belongings? Why had he behaved with such caution, such fear, during his stay at the hotel? And most of all, who was Don? His mother recalled that Artemus had mentioned someone by that name in one of his earlier letters. The tone in the letter, even then, suggested tension. But there were no details, no explanation of who Don was or what role he played in Artemis's life. The name remained an outline that no investigation could fill. If the identification offered one story, it was this: Artemus had not simply disappeared by accident, nor had he been living freely on his own terms. Something connected him to forces larger or darker than he had been able to escape, and whatever those forces were, they had found him in Kansas City. Now, the public had a name to attach to the tragedy. Yet the case remained just as directionless. Knowing that the victim was Artemus Ogletree did not answer why he was targeted, what he was involved in, or who ultimately caused his death. The identity solved only one part of the mystery, the who, while the how and why remained obscured, locked back behind the silence that had always surrounded room 1046. The story had moved forward, but the mystery had not lifted. In some ways, it had only deepened. After Artemus Ogletree was finally identified, his family arranged a modest funeral to lay him to rest. They had no clear understanding of how he had spent his last months, and even less understanding of the fear and injury that had marked his final days. For his mother, the grief was not only for the son she lost, but for the silent struggle he seemed to have endured far from home. The funeral was meant to be a moment of closure, a chance to bring him back into the care of those who had once known him. But the mystery of his death did not end there. In fact, what happened next only deepened the shadows around the story. Shortly before the burial, a bouquet of flowers arrived at the funeral home. They were elegant and carefully arranged, more elaborate than one would expect for a quiet family service. The card attached to the flowers carried a brief message: "Love forever." There was no address, no full name, no explanation. No one named Louise was known to the family. No letters from anyone by that name had ever been found among Artemis's belongings. The gesture was intimate and completely disconnected from anything the family understood about his life. Then came the phone call. The funeral home received a call from an unidentified man. His voice was calm, steady, and controlled. The kind of tone someone uses when they have prepared their words carefully. He stated that Artemus had been involved in a situation with several individuals, and that what had happened to him was the result of things that had to be done. The caller insisted that Artemus had lived a good life, and that there are many who cared for him. He then spoke of Louise, referring to her as someone who had loved him deeply. The man did not explain who he was or what role he had played. He did not discuss who those several individuals were. Instead, after delivering his message with an unsettling calmness, he ended the call abruptly. No trace of the call could be followed, and no one matching the voice was ever identified. This moment, quiet, brief, but unmistakably intentional, introduced a new layer to the case. Someone had known Artemus. Someone had cared enough to follow the news of his identification, send flowers, and make that call. But more importantly, someone wanted to control the narrative surrounding his death. The message carried the tone of closure, but not from the family's perspective. It was closure from someone who believed they held the truth and intended to keep it sealed. The flowers, the signature Louise, and the call suggested that Artemus had been part of a world hidden from his family, perhaps one that involved loyalty, secrecy, or obligation. Whatever that world was, It did not dissolve after his death. It watched, it acknowledged, and then it disappeared again. And the silence returned. Once Artemus Ogletree's true identity was confirmed, investigators hoped they could finally move toward understanding the larger forces surrounding him. One name stood out among the fragments left behind: Don. That name had been heard in the tense phone calls from room 1046. It was the name Artemus had spoken to the hotel staff, and it was mentioned, though briefly and without context, in one of his earlier letters home. Of all the mysteries surrounding the case, Don appeared to be the closest thing to a link between Artemus's past and his final days. Police attempted to trace the name in every way they could. They questioned hotel staff, searched through guest records, and contacted authorities in cities Artemus was known to have passed through. They looked into known associates, distant acquaintances, and even individuals with similar names. But nothing matched concretely. Don was a common name, and the case offered no surname, no description, no specific context to narrow it down. A name alone was not enough to build a path forward. What made the figure of Don especially significant was the tone of those phone calls. Witnesses described Artemus's voice as controlled, deferential, at times almost subdued. That tone suggested a relationship that involved pressure, dependence, or perhaps fear. It hinted at someone who held influence over him. But influence does not leave fingerprints or written records. Influence lives in the space between words, in silence, in obligation. And those things are not easily traced. Some investigators speculated that Don was involved in organized criminal activity. Others believed he may have been an older mentor, or someone Artemus had trusted before trust had turned into something heavier. Another theory held that Don was not a single person at all, but a name used to refer to a group or an arrangement, something hidden, something Artemus could not easily explain. There were also suggestions that Artemus may have entered a relationship or situation that complicated his sense of independence. None of these theories, however, collected enough evidence to move forward. Even the mysterious call at the funeral did not clarify Don's identity. The caller spoke with confidence and distance, as though he understood everything but intended to reveal nothing. The mention of several individuals implied that Artemus's story did not revolve around one person alone. Don might have been one piece of a larger network, personal, emotional, or situational. In the end, investigations into Don reached the same conclusion over and over. Someone knew what happened to Artemus, but that person, or those people, were committed to silence. No confession emerged. No accidental clue surfaced. The story of Don remained just out of reach, suspended like so much else in this case between speculation and absence. Time continued forward, and the lead that felt closest to the truth quietly dissolved into the larger mystery. Don remained a name without a face, a presence without a trace. With no clear suspect, no confirmed motive, and no reliable witness testimony, the case of Room 1046 eventually drifted into the category of cold cases. The investigation slowed not because of a lack of interest, but because there was simply nothing left to move forward with. The physical evidence in the room pointed to violence, yet offered no fingerprints that could be tied to another person. The emotional evidence, Roland's behavior, his silence, the mysterious phone calls suggested a story beneath the surface, but one that no one was willing to speak aloud. And the personal evidence, his identity, his relationships, the people who sent flowers and made phone calls, hinted at a hidden world that closed itself tightly once Artemus was gone. Over time, the case became a story retold more than it was investigated. Detectives retired, records were archived, and the hotel itself continued operating, the room eventually losing any physical trace of what had happened. Only the story remained, passed through newspapers, crime journals, and later books, and documentaries. What made the case unforgettable was not just the violence, but the silence that surrounded it. Silence from Artemus in his final hours. Silence from the mysterious individuals who contacted his family. Silence from the world he had been part of, whatever that world was. Then, decades later, the silence was briefly interrupted again. Around 2012, a man called a historian researching the case. His voice was older, steady, and purposeful. He claimed to know what had happened in room 1046. He did not give his name, nor explain how he knew. He simply said that it was not what people think and that the truth was never going to be known. And then, as before, the connection ended. The call provided no evidence, no leads, no verification. Just a reminder that someone, somewhere, still carried the story and still chose not to share it. Without further evidence, investigators and historians reached the same conclusion. The case cannot be solved with the information that remains. Crucial details disappeared with the people who lived them. The names have faded, the records are incomplete, and those who knew the truth kept it locked behind their own silence. The death of Artemus Ogletree was not forgotten, but it also was never explained. And so, the mystery endures, not as a puzzle waiting to be solved, but as a story that resists closure. The locked room, the false name, the dim lights, the whispered calls, the flowers signed Louise, the calm voice on the phone, all remain fragments of a narrative that refuses to come together. Room 1046 stands now, not just as a crime scene, but as a symbol of how some truths choose to stay hidden. In the end, the story of Room 1046 remains one of unanswered questions. A young man traveled under a name that was not his own. He stayed in a hotel room where he rarely opened the curtains, kept the lights low, and spoke in careful, measured tones to someone no one else ever saw. When violence came, it left behind a mystery rather than a message. No clear motive, no confirmed suspect, and no explanation that could be tied to evidence. Even after his real identity was revealed, the truth stayed just out of reach. The presence of the mysterious dawn, the flowers signed in the name Louise, and the final phone call from an unknown voice all suggest that Artemus was connected to something that never intended to be exposed. His silence, even in his last moments, may have been the final act of a promise, a fear, or a bond we still do not understand. Some stories are not unfinished because no one tried to complete them. They are unfinished because the people who held the answers chose not to speak. Sometimes, history leaves us standing in front of closed doors, knowing that something is on the other side, but unable to open them. Perhaps Room 1046 will remain exactly that. A room full of shadows, a name spoken quietly, a voice on the telephone that slipped back into the dark. Thank you for spending time here today, listening to this story. If you found it thoughtful or compelling, feel free to follow, subscribe, or simply join again next time. Wishing you a peaceful rest of your day. See you in the next story.